The best aircraft have often also been the fastest. The pursuit of speed has been part of the appeal of aviation from its earliest days. And often it is the most innovative and radical designs that break speed records. The Lockheed Blackbird uses new metals that came out of the space race and flies at over 3 times the speed of sound. Throughout the 1930s, one company in Britain was also obsessed with speed, and it was one man's dream to use a radical material to build the fastest aircraft in the world. The material was wood, and his name was Geoffrey de Havilland.
He was so very determined. Anything he wanted to do, he got on with it and did it. A real leader of people, not by driving them, but leading them from the front.
As early as the 1930s, de Havilland knew that lightweight wooden aircraft were the key to greater speeds. In 1934, his twin-engine Comet won the London to Melbourne, Australia air race. With speeds of over 200 miles per hour, the aircraft flew halfway around the world in just 77 hours. A ship would take 4 weeks. From his experience of building the Comet, de Havilland began to have a vision of building a super-fast, high-precision bomber. De Havilland was convinced that with the rise of the German Luftwaffe in the mid-1930s and the terror they inflicted during the Spanish Civil War, Britain would need all the heavy-duty air power it could produce.
It took the British quite a while to realize that the Germans had innovative designs, monoplane fighters, but more importantly, they had medium bombers that were being developed. And they had, in effect, tested them in the Spanish Civil War from 1936 onwards. It's a huge wake-up call.
At the time, the British Air Ministry believed that the future of bombing was in huge, heavily armed conventional bombers such as the Lancaster and Halifax. Radical new designs of lightweight aircraft were scoffed at. But Geoffrey de Havilland had other ideas and continued working on designs for his new bomber. His dream was to construct a cheap, easy-to-build aircraft powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Amazingly, it would have no guns, no armor plating, could carry up to 4,000 pounds of explosive, and with a speed of nearly 400 miles per hour, would be faster than any other aircraft in the world. But the most amazing concept of his vision was to build a warplane made entirely of wood. The aerodynamicists and the military men at the time ridiculed the idea, saying, "How can you build a modern bomber out of wood? How would it carry bombs? And how would it protect itself?" But de Havilland had all the answers. It wouldn't need to protect itself. Its defense would be speed. And as far as strength was concerned, pound for pound, timber has similar structural properties as aluminium and steel.
There's a shortage in Britain in the late 1930s of metal workers, of people skilled in the new technologies of fighter aeroplanes, of bomber aeroplanes. What you did have, though, was a nation of cabinet builders, of woodworkers, of individual small craftsmen. But more importantly, you can actually mobilize all of these people to build it, and you can make it, in effect, a cottage industry.
September 1939. With war in Europe, de Havilland is at last given the green light to build a prototype aircraft. Immediately, the de Havilland design team went into overdrive. Led by Ronald Bishop, they moved into a 17th century manor house called Salisbury Hall. This remote house was chosen to keep the new aircraft away from prying enemy eyes. By October 1939, work had begun on building a mock-up aircraft in the manor's enormous kitchen, and a hangar disguised as a barn was constructed at the western side of the moat.
We were working often periods of time, 6.5 days a week, and at some periods from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night.
But they were racing against the clock. In the spring of 1940, Germany conquered France, and the British Army was swept off the beaches of Dunkirk. With the Germans poised for invasion, Britain was fighting for its survival. Every effort was focused on holding back the Germans, and de Havilland's Wonder plane seemed destined never to leave the drawing board. By June 1940, the German army had advanced to the shores of the English Channel and was preparing to invade Britain. In 6 months, the Nazis had conquered Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and France. Britain was the only country left to face the onslaught of Nazi Germany. With Britain fighting for its life, priority was given to building only existing types of combat aircraft. Geoffrey de Havilland's radical new wooden bomber looked condemned to be scrapped. But de Havilland was not a man to take no for an answer.
Sir Geoffrey's words are, well, they may not want it now, but they will want it.
De Havilland persuaded the Air Ministry to let him continue as long as he did not use any of the vital materials required for the war effort. Throughout the summer of 1940, as Britain fought for survival against the German Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, de Havilland and his team worked on their wooden bomber. Finally, in December 1940, the aircraft was ready to be shown to the men from the ministry. It would be called the Mosquito. De Havilland had done the impossible. Using scraps from the British military machine, he had created the fastest aircraft in the world.
We knew it would fly. We were absolutely confident it would. And the question is how much better than the Spitfire it would be. Of course, we said it would be, and it was. 20 miles an hour faster.
The Air Ministry was so impressed with its performance that they placed an order for 150 Mosquitoes. It was an amazing contract for an untried and untested aircraft.
It's almost an impossible task. It's a wonderful thing to change from, they don't want it, and so give us more and more.
But it was de Havilland's vision of construction that answered this call and enabled the Mosquito to be built in vast numbers. A plan that was as simple in practice as it was visionary in conception. The aircraft was to be built like a model aircraft with wood, plywood, glue, and screws. Over 400 companies around Britain with woodworking craftsmen would make the various sections. The fuselage would be made in 2 halves before being bonded together. The wing would be assembled in one piece and then transported to the main factory for the final assembly. In all, over 6 tons of wood and nearly 50,000 brass screws were used in each aircraft. At 40 feet long and with a wingspan of 54 feet, a legend had been born. With a speed of 400 miles per hour, faster than any aircraft in the world, the Mosquito was ready to do battle. The RAF viewed these aircraft as too valuable to let just anybody fly them. Only the most experienced crews were selected. But for many of these men, powered by its 2 mighty Merlin engines, the Mosquito was unlike anything they had ever flown before.
The purr of a Merlin is something to experience, it really is. And then we taxied out and took off.
There you were, you suddenly look at the altimeter. The 1 minute you're down at 1,000 feet, next minute you're up at 30,000.
She would climb at 2,500 feet a minute, and that was really going some. You had to get into a jet to fly anything faster than that. If you started to mishandle her, pushing and pulling. In no time at all, you would over control, and she would be like a mosquito. She would sting you.
In July 1941, the first mosquitoes to go into service were delivered as photo reconnaissance units. It had taken only 22 months from the first drawings to delivery. Unarmed, bristling with up to 5 cameras, these aircraft were soon sweeping all over Europe, evading anti-aircraft guns and fighters. The Germans had nowhere to hide. Nothing was safe from the mosquitoes' prying eyes.
Photo reconnaissance was vital. We're talking the days before satellites, the days when human intelligence on the ground was limited. It was difficult to get back good information. Before every single Bomber Command raid over enemy targets, they had to take pictures of the targets, and in fact had to report the weather as well. So the Mosquito was an ideal aeroplane for that. In fact, you could say probably it was the best aircraft for this.
But it was as a bomber that the Mosquito came into its own. During the early part of World War II, bombing was a case of hit or miss. Aircraft flying at 16,000 feet would drop their bombs in huge numbers, trusting on flying skill, weather, and luck to hit their targets. But by mid-1942, the Mosquito bomber version was going to change all that. Relying solely on speed and height to outrun the enemy fighters, Mosquitoes could drop their bombs with pinpoint accuracy. Soon, Mosquitoes with payloads of up to 4,000 pounds, equivalent to a B-17 bomber, were an integral part of bombing missions. But to make the Mosquito even more deadly, they perfected the art of fast, low-level daylight raids.
We had to be under 50 feet to be under the radar. That's the whole point of low-level operations, so the Germans don't know you're coming. And then, of course, you had to go low over the target as possible, so that you took them hopefully by surprise.
Some daylight raids were flown at such low altitudes that Mosquitoes would often come back with strange souvenirs from their mission.
Many of Aussie pilots come back with telephone wires draped round his tail wheel. I know I've come back with branches of trees that weren't planted in England.
Mosquito squadrons were now becoming more and more daring in their attacks, none more so than the daylight raid against the Dutch Philips radio factory in Eindhoven. Intelligence had discovered that the Germans were using the factory for research into radar countermeasures and had to be destroyed. The raid would bring yet another unusual role for the Mosquito and its pilot.
They sent for me 3 days or 4 days before the raid and said, I've got a special job I want you to do. We've got a cameraman coming up and I want you to fly with him down the Scheldt Estuary.